Well, folks, you've made it all the way till Thursday. It is August the 10th, 2023. And if you're here, you're listening to Command Briefing. I am Jared A. Chambers, your host. Hey, thanks for joining, everyone. Appreciate you being here. Hope for those of you who've had a chance to listen to it, hope you really enjoyed last night's show. That was a lot of fun to do with our special guest, the Mighty Human Z, talking about Michigan. We had a little wrap-up session after last night's show, and the one thing that we both agreed upon is that we have to do it again because Georgia and Michigan, as well as Arizona, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, will continue to hinge heavily upon the 2024 election, as well as the indictment and trial of President Trump related to the election in January 6th. So much more going to come out with that. Did catch a little bit today. We know that there was an imminent arrest. This was from Steve Bannon's War Room. There was an arrest, apparently, that was going to happen. Bill Barr killed it. So we're going to continue to be watching this story unfold. I think there's a few others, too, out there who have a sense of how big this could possibly be in starting to unravel the pieces of election 2020 and the cheating. Now, again, there's so many different levels to it. One doesn't want to get off into the weeds. I think a lot of these things, they happen on a state level. And as I mentioned last night in our conversation, sometimes you don't actually have to order someone to do something like, hey, go steal an election for me. No, you put the right pieces in the right places and you set up incentive structures where people know what they have to do to get paid. And the money aspect of this, I think, is why this could start to pull some of the pieces together with the Democrat PAC money that was going towards getting fake voter registrations. And as I mentioned last night, some people may not understand, well, that's a registration. That's not the same thing as a ballot or even a ballot application. You can't dump a lot of fake ballots into the system without making sure the numbers line up. You got to have the registration show up first, because we're talking about huge numbers of ballots that were dumped into the system. If you go and look at those pre-bedtime election night totals from November of 2020, where Trump was leading in some cases by hundreds of thousands of votes in these respective states, only to get to 3 a.m. and suddenly be, maybe hundreds to a few thousand to maybe around 10,000 votes down. And then watch those votes just slowly trickle in across that next morning to where Trump barely lost, and it only accumulated to a total of about 43,000 votes across several states that made the difference in whether he won or not. They had to dump a lot of ballots into the system, and the ballots they would have dumped in, we know, they did it the same way by skirting around the law, the specific needs to verify signatures, to have reliable, documented chain of custody of ballots to have everything match up the way that the law required, and it didn't. So we're going to continue to follow that story, because if Trump and his lawyers are smart, they absolutely will litigate all of this in the course of the accusations against him. Many of these accusations, as we've talked about, they've never seen their day in court. They've been pushed aside on standing. They've been pushed aside because people who could have pushed for change refused to. People who could have said, hey, this isn't right, this doesn't follow the law, just threw their hands up and said, hey, no, I want no part of this. And then the courts were reluctant to involve themselves, where those who had the best ability to do it, the Republican state legislatures of the stolen states, refused to do anything. And now we get a chance to look at this. It will matter to public perception. It will matter to motivation of people to get out and vote in the next election. I think that's one thing that we saw in 2022. Now, of course, Trump wasn't on the ballot, but so many people tried to pretend that was a referendum on Trump. And I know that it wasn't. He wasn't on the ballot. Some candidates, yes, he endorsed, and some of those candidates actually did well. Of course, the people that his detractors like to point out are those who didn't do well. Dr. Oz, Herschel Walker, a few others. But these were not true MAGA Trumpian candidates. They were endorsements. They were cutouts. They were fill-ins, where nobody good ran in some of these elections. Was Herschel Walker the best candidate in Georgia? I'm in Georgia. I will tell you, no. I gladly voted for him. And I even like a lot of things about Mr. Walker, but far from a perfect candidate. I like Dr. Oz less, but I'm not a Pennsylvanian. It wasn't my business. But are you going to tell me that somebody better was running in that race? And don't start again with the Kathy Barnett thing. Complete kook. Didn't have the infrastructure. Didn't have the record, frankly. Again, this is one of those things. Sometimes people are too quick to fall in love when somebody says something that they like, without looking at the fact that these people have records that you could judge. Trump knows this. Trump didn't endorse someone who could have been a Trojan horse, could have been a complete kook, had a lot of room to do damage to him and the party, even more so than Dr. Oz, in fact, because she was too unknown and too flaky. So we have a lot of interesting things that we're going to continue to follow on that front, knowing that Trump's fate and our fate are in many ways tied together. The next election will prove whether we can have elections in this country. It will prove whether we can have elections where we select between people that we have put forward as fellow citizens to run, rather than being candidates picked for us from the ruling caste of this country. You know, a lot of people forget tyrants have very often been elected. Totalitarian countries, they do have elections. Soviet Union had them. What were you really deciding, though? When you choose options that are curated and presented for you, then that's not really a choice. It's an illusion of choice. And we've seen in those places that illusion of choice held those places together along with fear for a certain period of time, but it always came unraveled. I don't think America would last that long. I think there's enough people out there who still will not tolerate the unfairness that they've seen, the lawlessness that they've seen from their own government. And that is where many of us today, we are categorized, by the way. We are lawful but awful. Lawful but awful. That coming from a conversation with ex-CEO, Linda, I can't pronounce her last name. In fact, she has changed her Twitter handle. It's Linda Y something X now. She's adopted the branding. But it's interesting that she has adopted the branding of new X over Twitter so much when she is so committed to the Twitter that was. The Twitter that bans, that shadow bans, that stifles free speech. What is the new path? The new path is we're not going to ban people. We're just simply going to make sure if it's lawful but awful, meaning we don't like it, we think this is bad speech, we'll just simply work to make sure no one sees it. Well, hey, maybe that is a step up over old Twitter. They never admitted to shadow bans, even though we knew that they were real. You know, we could see the evidence in our own accounts, our ability to grow following. But now, shadow banning is apparently the policy. If it's lawful but awful, we'll make sure that no one sees it. Scary, scary stuff. Even as some social media posts out there, folks, do stay up. They stay out there long enough, maybe speech that's not even lawful, enough to gain the scrutiny of the fearless FBI. Fearless, of course, dripping with sarcasm. They're scared of their own shadows, apparently. Why do I say that? If you have to raid a man's house in a pre-dawn raid who's obese, 75 years old, walks with a cane, cares for his disabled son, if that requires you to bash in the door in a pre-dawn raid, armed to the teeth, apparently you're afraid of a lot. Scared of your own shadow. And maybe it's the case that this administration is afraid of a lot, and what it needs to do is send a message to everyone out there: don't mess with us. This isn't a new thing, of course. We saw it in Waco. We saw it in Ruby Ridge. Forget for a moment what the charges are. Forget for a moment whether you agree or disagree with charging someone over perhaps threatening social media posts. If you have tailed someone for months, and we are finding out, apparently they had him under physical surveillance for months. This wasn't their first time showing up. This wasn't an anonymous tip. If you know that you're dealing with someone who's elderly, overweight, doesn't get around well, leaves the home on a regular basis, why in the world is the right way to handle and arrest a pre-dawn raid? In fact, why is that the right way to arrest anyone? I mean, we've seen it with people like Roger Stone. White-collar crime of somebody who posed no danger, wasn't a flight risk. I mean, knew in advance he was under scrutiny from the government. Why are we doing these pre-dawn raids? I mean, even in other parts of the country, we've seen the consequences of these sorts of things. What happens in cases where law enforcement gets an incorrect address and comes busting in on somebody half asleep in the dark. In many cases, the person having no reason to think that law enforcement should be after them at all. So think about it. If your door comes crashing in the wee hours of the morning in the dark, are you going to presume good faith just because they scream police or FBI or law enforcement? I wouldn't. I mean, if it's that simple, I mean, every robber now has their formula. Every home invader has their formula. Just yell, FBI, and no one can shoot back. Really, really sick stuff. Another story to follow. All of these things tying together just as a reminder tonight where we're at with all of this. With social media, with the courts, with the current administration. We are living in an age of fear. We are under pressure. I believe that pressure is going to find a positive release valve. I believe people are going to stand for this country in a way that is unprecedented, that has not been seen in recent times, and it's going to come through in the next election. But we have to continue to fight for it, and we're going to stay on top of these stories. We'll be right back in just a minute. We're going to go to an ad break, but on in a minute with the rest of the news of the day. Stay with us. Hey, welcome back, everyone. Appreciate you hanging in there. We are back with Command Briefing. You know, as I mentioned, last night's show was a lot of fun to do. It's always fun when you have a guest and you can have a great conversation with somebody who's knowledgeable. This may have come through. When you do a show and you're putting out content daily, some days there's more to talk about than others. And on Tuesday's show, where I talked about the outcome of that trial in Portland, the civil trial around the attackers of Andy No, Antifa attackers, and them being found not liable for the immense injuries that they caused this man. I talked a little bit about how, it's obvious. If you haven't understood it till now, these people really just want you dead. And it's something that I've understood for a while. And when you're talking about it in the moment, first of all, that news had come through. It was very demoralizing news. To reiterate again the stakes that we find ourselves in at this moment. Sometimes it's hard to be high energy about it. And Tuesday's show, I was not feeling the energy talking about it, even though I knew it was important and I knew it was worthy of repeating. But at the same time, you know, it's not always gripping broadcasting, talking about these things, especially when you're reiterating points that deep down, I think that we all know, but you don't want to know. But then it was after that, after talking about how these people really do want us dead, It was after that, this FBI raid in Utah, and having to stare that in the face once again, that life is very meaningless to the people that we're up against. Now, some people will try to justify this, try to wrap their head around it. There's a lot of normalcy bias. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance when you're dealing with the idea that our very social contract has been voided out by the globalists, by the Marxists. You know, they want to do things on their terms. They don't want everyone to realize things all at once and rise up and fight against them. But they are perfectly happy to work and demoralize you and take people out as they go. What happened to this man in Utah, again, is unconscionable when you know, regardless of the charges, he could have been arrested in another way. But at some point, we do have to actually examine the charges. Why is it okay for some people to threaten a president visually and vividly, as we saw in the case of President Trump when he was in office, in songs and videos, in protests and marches, in violence on the streets? President Trump was threatened many times, many times. It didn't even warrant an arrest, much less a pre-dawn raid. I'm against the pre-dawn raid, regardless of circumstance. But we do have to have one set of laws. We do. It's not enough to say, hey, maybe the pre-dawn raid was a bad idea, but he really shouldn't have done that. He really shouldn't have done that. Folks, political violence has been a real thing throughout history, and I'm a believer that violence should be avoided when other solutions are still available to you. I'm not for assassinating the president. You shouldn't be either. These are not rational things to believe or undertake while we still have battles that we can fight in the political process. But you have to realize when you see political violence enacted against people over and over, and look, that summer of 2020 was political violence. Those George Floyd protests were political violence. The riots that we saw in the aftermath of Michael Brown, the fraudulent hands up, don't shoot, which never happened, those riots and protests. The Antifa violence. Somebody like Andy Ngo not able to get the police to act on his behalf, much less the courts. Folks, when you do that over and over and people feel under threat, they look for a release valve. I mean, human nature is a thing. It's a thing. It's not always pretty. You don't always agree with it, but it's a thing. And people are actually, in many ways, very predictable. When you feel threatened, when a person feels threatened, it's a natural thing to lash out. And maybe not in actual violence. Talk of violence is its own relief valve. May not be a good thing. I'm not encouraging people to do this, mind you. Don't make threats on social media. Don't talk about things that you wouldn't want to see your name printed with in the newspapers. Things that you wouldn't want to see your face and voice with on the television. It's better not to speak those things. I'm not encouraging this. I'm talking about human nature as it exists academically. And you can't continue to threaten people using the force of the government and using agents of government power who are not truly employed by the government, but which get a wink and a nod. It's okay to do what you're doing, whether it's an Antifa protester or an inner city riot. When people feel threatened, they're eventually going to respond to the threat. That's the danger. It starts in making threats in kind. That's your canary in the coal mine. That is an opportunity to de-escalate the situation in which we find ourselves. No one's doing that, and that's the real crime here. It's not just what happened to an elderly man in Utah, although that is more than bad enough. It is that this moment, that is the signal that we're reaching a boil. You've seen water boil. You've put a pot on the stove before. You see those little bubbles starting to form in the bottom of the pan. They haven't risen to the top yet, but they're there. They're growing in number. They're getting larger. And pretty soon, unless you turn the heat down, those bubbles are going to rise to the top. And then you're going to get a rolling boil. We're seeing the bubbles out there. We have an opportunity to de-escalate. That is one of the things that motivates me day to day, and it's why I'm here, it's why I'm on Twitter, it's why these things are important to me. We should be living in the golden age of humanity right now. We have at our disposal more technology, more resources than ever before. The world in so many ways has gotten smaller, and while I don't advocate globalism, the potential for true cooperation amongst nations is greater than it's ever been. The ability to mutually beneficially exchange resources, to trade, to conduct commerce, it's greater than it's ever been. We should be able to go to the store and not only afford things there, which is getting harder and harder to do, but in fact, they should be ridiculously cheap to obtain the basic necessities of life: food, energy, shelter. The resources are there. The economic growth, the real upshot for people in this day and age, in the 21st century, should be expansion of the human imagination, the ability to come up with even newer technologies, newer ideas, new creations. Instead, we're struggling to buy houses and cars. We're struggling to buy groceries. We're under constant pressure and constant threat of war, of nuclear war, between nations that have no reason to be even thinking about such a conflict. Who can comprehend this? We have to de-escalate what's going on. And I am for doing it through the political process where we can. And I believe that this is too much to just simply dismiss, deny. When the government is focused on one man because they believe he represents the threat to their status quo, their power, and they're willing to do anything to stop him, that's who you've got to back, because this is no longer a policy election. This is no longer about the minutiae going on out there. This is the big deal to wrestle power and de-escalate globally and here at home. We should all want that, and we have an opportunity to do it. And I have some good news on that front, by the way, but we're going to take another break, and we'll be right back in just a moment. Are you ready to fight, people? Are you ready to take this thing back? Are you ready to show that we will not stand for what is going on, that we insist upon living in the golden age of America that we know this can be? Are you ready to make America great again? Again. Jared A. Chambers here with the second part of Command Briefing. Thanks for hanging through the break. I mentioned there is positive news, I think. Trump is not going to sign the pledge. He refuses. What pledge am I referring to? So, the Republican Party, in its infinite wisdom, had a pledge for all of the candidates wishing to participate in the debates that they would, regardless of who becomes the nominee for the Republican Party, that they would all support the nominee for the Republican Party. Once upon a time, I was a big fan of this sort of thing, because I will tell you why. Let me give you the old situation so that we can advance to present day, what's happening now. If the Republican Party, if any political party works as it's supposed to be working, it puts resources towards all of the candidates. It puts forward an infrastructure that all of the candidates use to make their case. It provides the shell surrounding everything. I mean, I think, again, infrastructure is the best way to look at it. Everyone's taking advantage of infrastructure like roads, highways, like actual physical infrastructure. Same thing within a party. They're accessing the ability for communications, for donor lists, for voter lists, so many resources that you get to take advantage of, including the ability to stand on stage with your competitors and make your case. Once upon a time, it made sense, I thought, for the party to demand, if you're going to avail yourself of the party's resources, that you accept the verdict of the primaries, and that when the primaries are over, you get behind whoever won. That is when I, like I think many other people, had a more idealized view of how things were working, should work during the primaries. How often have we heard people say, when we have a rhino out there, when things are not going as they should, and everyone's immediate response is, primary them. We've got to primary that guy. We've got to put somebody up against. Got to primary them. Only to find out over and over through the years that infrastructure is not distributed fairly to different candidates. They all don't have an equal opportunity. In fact, candidates do get propped up, and the voters pushed aside, sometimes in small ways and sometimes in very big ways. I still remember the primary in Alaska where Lisa Murkowski finally lost and was not the Republican nominee for Senate. Somebody else was. And the party set out, instead of making sure that the new nominee won, they set out to make sure that Lisa Murkowski, now running as an independent, that she won. And Mitch McConnell and the Republican Party allowed her to come right back, switch, put that R right back behind her name, get back all of her committee assignments, didn't skip a beat, people. And over the last, I would say, 10, 12 years, it's just really become more obvious to me that our reliance on the fairness of primaries and primaries being a way to provide infrastructure for new candidates to step forward, it's not realistic. We saw that in 2016. They never wanted to accept Trump. There was constant effort from the threat of a floor fight at the convention through moves being made after the Access Hollywood tape came out to push the primary winner aside in favor of who they wanted instead. And if the party is not going to be fair to upstart candidates, to outsider candidates, why do we pledge any loyalty? Now, granted, I would have liked to have seen, maybe during Trump's time in the wilderness since 2020, maybe more could have been done to build a parallel infrastructure besides the Republican Party. It would have taken a billionaire to do it, frankly. That's no small undertaking. That's why generally third-party notions are futile, because you need an infrastructure to run. You need a way to raise money. You need a way to get voter lists. You need to be able to set up and get out the vote operation. The Republican Party has the means, the infrastructure to do that, even though otherwise, in many ways, the party has become worthless. But Trump chose not to set up that parallel infrastructure. But he's not going to sign that pledge. And thank God he's not. Number one, why be a hypocrite about it? Why commit when you're standing up as an outsider to the entire establishment? Why should you commit, even though it's far-fetched and would never happen? What person in their right mind would commit to supporting Asa Hutchinson or Chris Christie or some of these names that I can't even remember because they're unknown? It's ridiculous. So rather than be a hypocrite about it, he chose to say, I'm not going to sign this. Now, it's easier to do when you don't need that particular debate stage, and Trump doesn't. And I wouldn't want to see him get up there, not with the lead that he has, which is statistically, historically insurmountable. Nobody else has a shot to beat him. We know that he's under threat from these wild-eyed prosecutors who would love nothing more than to have a gag order slapped upon him. Why would Trump walk into a setup where those people aren't stupid? They know the things that could land Trump in hot water, that they're going to hit and attack on that again and again and loudly and vigorously trying to get a response, hoping, again, as some candidates obviously do, that Jack Smith and Merrick Garland will do the dirty work for them of sidelining Trump. Trump would be foolish to get into such a mix as that. It doesn't look weak. Would it look weak if anyone else was in striking distance of him in the election? I would say, yeah. Sometimes you have to suck it up and do what you got to do, even though it sucks when there is distance in front of you, when there's a road to travel and you just got to put your walking shoes on and do it. That's not the case here. No one's in striking distance. There's no case that he needs to make. His support continues to grow. There's alternate avenues for him to reach out to voters. He's very good at using them. And I can see why some of the other candidates are upset by this whole thing, because they're not good at using those alternate avenues. They're not good at retail campaigning. If you're Ron DeSantis, you're really looking for a medium, for a forum that you think is going to play to your strengths. And at this point, I struggle really seriously wondering if the man even has a strength in terms of campaigning. Doesn't look like it. But it's clear that he thinks, at least, that a debate stage is a better forum for him than is walking around Iowa and meeting voters. That's gone poorly, frankly. Mr. DeSantis is so enamored with the debate format, in fact, he's put himself out there to go up against Gavin Newsom in November, which that seems like a low upside shot for him, but hey, maybe he's at a point where there's nowhere to go but up in his mind. But it is telling. The people who want to choose who we focus on, who focus where the attention is so that they can promote their chosen candidates, they love the debate format too. Fox wants you watching the debate. They don't want you to watch because they think it's going to help Trump. There's people who want you to watch that DeSantis-Newsom debate. They're not doing it because they are in favor of Trump or Biden, frankly. Notice how that works. I mean, just like we've been told that there are wonder boys on our side, that people like DeSantis get lifted up, just like, Scott Walker or Rick Perry or Tim Pawlenty was in years past. Hey, everyone, look at this. This is the next coming thing. Well, the Democrats do that too, and you've heard that one name over and over, Gavin Newsom. Why? The only reason he withstood a recall is because the Republican Party, the Republicans in California, were crazy enough to run a true conservative ideologue against him. It was easy to not like Gavin's job performance when he was just up against a generic somebody else, but it's still California. You pit him against a true right-wing conservative, the California comes right back out in him. In other words, what I'm saying is he's not a particularly strong governor, strong candidate. This is another media creation. And I think that Trump is right to avoid this media-created spectacle, which has a lot of downside, no upside. He's right to not be a hypocrite about this. And then the next question becomes, does he come back to Twitter? I mean, X at some point. Never going to get used to that. X. Does Trump come back there? The best argument that I've heard for that is that in some ways, that's where it all began for Trump. And in some ways, I would say, I would add to that, personally, that's where it all sort of ended in 2020, early 2021. It would be a triumphant return for Trump. It would send a bold message. There's an argument to be made there. It's one of the better ones that I've heard, actually. On the other side of that, again, I'm not real happy with where Twitter/X is going. I'm not happy with the new CEO. I'm not happy with the controlled opposition where Elon Musk can give some payouts, can give some big money to a few big conservative influencers to promote this idea, hey, we're fair and we're paying people for their content, while thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of small accounts never got this general amnesty that was promised. So many promises, the shadow banning that we were going to see how and why and if you were shadow banned. Never happened. It was promised. So in so many ways, I'm just not impressed with the direction of the platform, and I don't think that Trump truly needs it to move forward. But maybe making that triumphant return is worth considering. We will see. In the meantime, let's take one more break, and we'll come back in just a moment to wrap things up. Let's launch into the last segment. Thanks for hanging in and listening to the show tonight. So we talked a little bit in terms of that debate, Trump's obvious advantages and lack of a need to move forward in doing something that poses a little upside. But speaking of upside, Trump has the largest advantage over DeSantis ever. This according to the 538 poll average, where Trump stands now with an advantage of 39.4 points, standing at 53.7%. DeSantis down to 14.3%. And while all of the polls aren't exactly in line, we do see certain trends, chiefly the advantage of Trump over DeSantis. Trump continuing to rise while DeSantis continues to fall. But now, too, we do have one poll at least where Ramaswamy has taken second place over DeSantis. Now, do I expect to see that in every poll in the coming weeks? No, it's another harbinger of where DeSantis is. He is a bottom-tier candidate officially now. I mean, this is no longer a second place run, even though he is technically in the second spot. The difference between Trump and DeSantis has become so insurmountably great that now DeSantis is a backbencher like any of the rest of them. And whether he stands at 13 points in one poll or 11.5 in the other, or maybe a bump up to, 15 in one, it doesn't matter when all of his competition is much, much, much closer mathematically to him than he is to Trump. And there is an expectation that given the outcome of some of these debates, as well as states where some of these other candidates might have an advantage in an early state race, DeSantis, second place is meaningless. These are distinctions without differences at this stage. It's not anything that's sustainable. I think he does have money coming from certain donors that will allow the illusion to carry on a bit longer, although we know that that's going to dry up, that it is in fact in the process of drying up. I don't think that this is going to happen overnight, but I think between now and Iowa, it's not a given that DeSantis, if he's still even in the race, goes into Iowa even being able to claim second place. And if he is, in fact, still in the race by then, and even if he's polling nationally in second place, I think there's a real good chance that somebody like a Tim Scott or some other known quantity who is better at retail can overtake DeSantis. So, again, second place in name only. It is no longer a meaningful distinction. These are clear trends that he is suffering. He is suffering because he has run a bad campaign. There is no other way to put it. There are people out there, I talk with some of them. Every once in a while I try to be civil with some of them, who still think that this is about criticizing Trump and talking about Trump's weaknesses. To which I can only answer at this point, we know. Trump didn't accomplish everything he set out to do. We know. The wall wasn't completely finished. We know. 2020 and COVID policy was an absolute total abortion and will forever live as a low point in American history. We know. What else you got? What else have you got about Trump that I haven't said myself, by the way? I've been willing to criticize where I've thought it was warranted, but you got to put some context around it. You've got to put the context of who in the government was doing better. Who in the government or running for office promised more than what Trump did? Who, as president, has had both parties working equally hard against his core agenda? Sure, Trump got a lift once in a while. Tax cuts? Hey, great. Paul Ryan will work with you on that. And I think that the Trump tax cuts were largely good. Could they have been better? You bet they could have. Because it was always going to be the core GOP establishment that made sure that the tax cuts targeted people they owed favors to, corporatism. Trump was there to make sure that at the end of the day, it was an across-the-board tax relief package, which made it a good thing and something that needed to be done. But outside of that, both parties working against him. So whatever you've got on him, we know. Some of it, there's valid reasons to say, hey, I'll give him a mulligan on that one. Some of them, yeah, I'm a little bitter about too. But what you don't have, what you just very, very obviously at this point don't have is an alternative. DeSantis is going to hire better people. He can't even hire the right people for a campaign or keep them. Oh, by the way, if he has to let some of those people go off the campaign, he'll port them right over into working for the Florida state government, though. Got to make sure that those, backs get scratched out there. Good old politics. Yeah, you thought he was above that, didn't you? Nope. No, it's been an awful campaign with an awful launch, with awful messaging, with a candidate who doesn't do retail very well. He's just flat not a good candidate. He gets trounced in the Midwest. Does he have advantages in certain locations? Would he have an advantage running in Metro Atlanta? Maybe. Especially with somebody like, Kemp out there working hard for somebody like DeSantis as a kindred spirit. Maybe it would be a little easier for DeSantis to win Georgia or Arizona. I don't know. It's not to say I don't think that Trump can win too. Who has the easier row to hoe in those two states, though? Maybe it is DeSantis. I can't promise you it's not. What I can tell you is that the man loses the entire Midwest, if he even makes it that far, because he can't even economically run his own campaign. It's horrible. And it's over. And you don't have an alternative. You got to have an alternative at some point. And the trend lines are there. It's done. What can we say? It's Trump. Get on board. This is the existential fight. Folks, thanks for listening tonight. This has been the Command Briefing. I'm your host, Jared A. Chambers. Find me on Twitter at C4CEO. Just to let you know, we're going to continue working on some cool things. Stay tuned. Follow. Listen. I do appreciate it. Have a good night.